I wanted to introduce Kathleen McElroy. So Kathleen is director of the School of Journalism at University of Texas and also a professor at UTexas Austin. You are going to hear from a lot of overachievers in the next 4 days, but Kathleen is one of the most distinguished of that. After a 30-year career at the New York Times and many other places, she got a PhD in journalism. And she also administers the Dan Rather Awards. And she has a superpower, which is that Kathleen manages to teach people how to be better and correct innumerable errors while not making you feel stupid or embarrassed. And it really is extraordinary.
It's the middle child syndrome. I was a middle child. Is anyone else here a middle child? Yeah, if you're a middle child, you learn how just to go under the radar. And as an editor, that served me so well because in the end, you want the reporter to think, that new lead is that reporter's idea. That wasn't your idea, right? So it's sort of like, in fact, I've gotten a criticism. Someone said, you never say no, because I always go, well, what if we did X, Y, and Z? So now on my desk, I have the word says nope, which is about as far as I'll go. Thank you so much.
Thank you for coming. And we invited Kathleen to talk about objectivity because we think that this is one of the biggest challenges. When I covered the Boston State House back when dinosaurs roamed the earth, we fought about every single thing about coverage, exposing corruption, what we could and couldn't say. Journalistic norms were beginning to be questioned. But the one thing we never fought about was objectivity. And I know that we're in a different world here, so we wanted to start with that. We've been having a lot of interesting conversations. Particularly last week, we ran a fellowship in DC called Widening the Pipeline for Journalists of Color. And this whole question of, what is your identity? You were hired in some ways to represent, quote unquote, your community, but at the same time, you're supposed to be objective. But then if you're Latino and you cover immigration, then you're accused of not being objective, et cetera. And then the very definition, as Ann said, about what is objective is under question. So Kathleen, the easiest subject of our entire fellowship. Over to you.
Yeah, right. And I just realized I put my notes in my phone, so let me pull out my phone. So there's a judge who made a ruling on Friday in which a Washington Post reporter who had sued the Post for taking her off Me Too coverage because she had tweeted out about Kobe Bryant's, the charges against him. She got suspended for that, but then they sort of took that back because everybody was outraged. And she sued because they would not allow her to cover any information on sexual harassment. Well, the judge ruled in the Post's favor, and I'm looking for the sheet that actually, because there is an incredible quote that he said. This is when your notes are too good, and there are too many of them, right? Let me see if I can find them. Just give me half a second. Oh, while I'm looking for this, I will tell you something interesting. I had a student who was covering the legislature here, and this was way back when Bush II was president. And she was so proud of herself because she got all of these legislators to tell her why Obama's practice of no child left behind was terrible. And this was a terrible Obama policy, and Obama was just a horrible person for even having come up with this. Now, this had actually passed through another class, and she got an A on it. The problem is it was a Bush policy, not an Obama policy. So I said, well, the problem is this was done under the Bush administration. She was horrified. She was like, oh my God, I can play you the manuscript. I can play everything back. I can show you the transcripts. I can play this. I know I didn't make this up. And I said, you transcribed them correctly. They lied to you. And that was such an eye-opener to her. Up until that point, she thought, somebody tells you something, you write it down. Now, you all passed that, but think about that first moment when you wrote something down because somebody said it. We can look at the release that the coroner did after George Floyd, right? So people tell you something, you write it down. There was a happy ending. She went back to those legislators, and they spoke to her again, and she got the quotes, different quotes in which they said how Obama had ruined No Child Left Behind. But it was an introduction for this sophomore to spin and to a lot of things. And it just goes to show you, even at the most basic level, state house reporting, especially in crazy states like this one. And by the way, all of y'all are from crazy states. All state legislatures are crazy. That's the definition, you know. That's why it's so different. Well, it used to be very different from the federal government. But so the judge ruled, essentially, in terms of this case, that it was okay that the Post took her away from that type of coverage because it's what essentially the Washington Post readers deserved. And let me see if I can find this story on my phone. And apparently I'm still looking for the hotel on my phone. I have not turned that off, but I have notes here. And I hope you all don't mind that I'm casual here. By the way, y'all is a perfectly good gender-neutral word. We are moving away from you guys. I'm trying my best to use y'all. I don't agree that it can be singular. I still think it should be for plural, but y'all is okay. So the judge wrote, I'm going to do this, accepting the truth of Mrs. Sommiers' assurances of her objectivity, it does not follow that readers of the Post would have confidence that its stories were the product of objective reporting, and that the stories were not affected even by implicit biases of a reporter who made public statements about her own personal experiences with the subject of the story, because she had been sexually assaulted. News media companies have the right to adopt policies that protect not only the fact, but also the appearance of impartiality. The appearance of impartiality. So it's a facade. That might be too rough a word, but we are talking about something that is strategic. So this judge is protecting the Washington Post readers from a reporter. Okay, so let's think about this. What if this reporter worked for the 19th, which is based here in Austin? Do you think her having been sexually assaulted and making that public would affect her ability to cover sexual harassment? Well, she tweeted, like, while everybody's saying how wonderful Kobe Bryant is, it's actually, these are two different issues. Don't forget that he was charged with sexual assault case in Colorado and settled out of court. She also had written, the person she has accused of assaulting her is another journalist, and someone wrote an article about it, and that article needed a correction. And the Post claimed that she sought a correction about something that happened in her life, deemed that she was no longer quote unquote objective. I am not making this up. So the point that a couple of you made, I was on a panel and that had happened. I had a student, sadly, so many of my students have been assaulted, and a student wanted to do a panel on coverage of sexual assaults because she said someone she'd interviewed had thought she'd done a really good job. And the panelists who had been assaulted all said when people had been in that same circumstance, interviewed them, they did a much better job. They were not re-traumatized. The questions were more sensitive, and it felt like it gave them more of a sense of closure. So in one sense, we're seeing where under the facade of impartiality, not even impartiality, but the appearance. See, that's what's important to me when we talk about objectivity. Now, those who defend objectivity, like this judge, don't look like me.
it really does cement this definition of objectivity
Right.
in legal precedent, right?
That's what's scary.
Yes, absolutely. It's just like, it is mind-blowing that a judge is saying that a newsroom has a right to create those policies.
It's like it's 1965 all over again, right? So that's the thing that worries me. You know, I'm glad I didn't have slides because I wouldn't have been able to get this all in here. But you bring up a point that here is, we're cementing a concept that the original title of this was going to be Objectivity and Obituary. Well, this judge pretty much is taking care of that. So what I was saying, the people who defend this, and I won't go into some names, some of them are famous, some of them I've actually debated in nice debates, they don't look like me. They're living in a default world. Now, what do I mean by a default world? You all know what I mean by a default world, right? Their appearance, here we have the word appearance again, does not come into question. The ones who most loudly defend objectivity defend it as a scientific method, which if you really look into scientific method has its own issues, but okay. So I'm going to give you a brief history. Are all of you familiar with the history of objectivity? So you know, by the way, it's a business strategy. Objectivity is a business strategy. So you come out of partisan newspapers in the late 1800s, starting to the mid and blah, blah, blah. And the partisan papers are replaced with penny press. And anyone who's better on history, please correct me because I'm not an expert on news. I've now decided I want to become an expert on objectivity. I am an expert on objectivity. I'm going to own it. But not necessarily all newspaper history. The penny press is for the masses, literally a penny. When things got a little bit better, they made it 2 pennies, maybe up to, you know, as opposed to 6 pennies, which was too much, especially for immigrant populations, for lower classes. And at that point, you also want to reach the masses. So being partisan is probably not the best way to go, right? So now we have this rise of trying to appeal to more people by getting away from being partisan throughout the publication, okay? Now, yes, there's sensationalism, there's Pulitzer, there's Hearst, we know all the things, we know the Spanish-American War never should have happened. So I'm not saying these are perfect presses, but they do now steer toward being, they're not gonna be blatantly politically partisan, though they will have their causes, if that makes sense, okay? So, Lippman, you've heard of Lippman, stereotypes in my head or pictures in my head, blah, blah, blah. He and someone named Mertz are horrified by the New York Times coverage of the Russian Revolution. Essentially, they say like reporters are like accidental eyewitnesses. They don't know what they're doing. So in 1919, they come up with this, do you pronounce it tresties? Big, long thing that is really not readable these days. But that becomes the basis for saying that reporters should adopt the objective method. Somehow that turned into objectivity. And it became what Tuckman, who is a sociologist, by the way, all the best journalism research is done by non-journalists. Because they go, well, why did you do that? Or why did you do that? And there are things that, you know, as a former journalist, I would look at and go, I know why they did that. So a lot of the best journalism research is done by non-journalists. But Tuckman looks into objectivity as a strategic ritual. Ooh, let's break that down. So what happens is a lot of journalism in the 50s and 60s, to be perfectly honest, even a lot of the coverage of the civil rights movement is stenography. It's not journalism. What people are doing now are just always getting all kinds of voices. They're like my sophomore student. They're just recording what people are telling them. Tuckman becomes interested because it's clear that, you know, journalism had actually gone a little bit past that with the McCarthy era. All of a sudden, McCarthy, oh, does this sound familiar? people just had to say, wait a second, beyond the opinion pages, that this man is a fraud, this man is lying. But it took a long time. It took a long time for that to happen. So in the early 70s, and this is right before Watergate too, sociologists are looking at what journalism is. And Tuckman finds that a lot of what journalism calls objectivity is a ritual. We're going to quote a lot of people. We're going to present as many sites as possible. We're going to do these sort of things. But the fourth thing that she brings up that's really interesting, that one thing that journalists can't hide behind, and she essentially says they're hiding behind this strategic ritual, is the lead, the way you compile facts. Because at one point, as a journalist, as a producer of content, you have to organize that content. And you will be making decisions. As you all know, if you were all given the same set of facts, we'd end up with 25 different stories. The materiality of what you think the essence of the news story is really does come into play when you write that lead, when you distribute that content. So no matter how quote unquote objective someone is, if you buy into objectivity, at one point your organization of information is your perspective, your news judgment. You can't escape that. When an editor changes your lead to make it something else, that editor has put his, her, their news judgment on top of yours. So all of this is kind of obvious, but no one had said it, really. So every now and then, this whole concept of objectivity comes in and out of fashion. I mean, like, again, in the 70s, there were all these headlines, oh, the young reporters, because of new journalism and gonzo journalism and all of that, all those young people. Thomas Wolfe wasn't that young, though, so I don't know where that come up with that. But the whole idea that, oh, what they were doing was new and hip and more real than what traditional journalists were doing. So the whole idea of objectivity comes and goes and comes and goes. I actually wrote a piece for Poynter on objectivity before COVID and George Floyd, because I've always seen it used as a weapon against journalists of color and women and people from marginalized groups. So I'm going to go back to the two types of objectivity. There is objectivity, which is a reporting method, and there is objectivity that is imposed by appearance. Okay? So, as, I can't think of her name, she wrote Within the Veil. I see her book. Anyway, I see the book cover. I'll get you all these resources. I'll make sure you have access to it. There were black reporters not allowed to cover the O.J. Simpson trial because they were black. As I wrote in the piece for Poynter, I don't think any white reporters were banned from the Timothy McVeigh trial because they were white. So there's always been this thing that the reason you might have been hired is also a reason that you may not be unbiased enough. I mean, try to unwrap that concept, right? Should women be allowed to cover abortion? Should blacks be allowed to do this? You know, Latinos covering immigration, as if immigration is the only issue in the Latino community, right? Which is a whole, we could spend days on, you know, the 9 things that we all get to cover all the time. So what I have always worried about is that it comes into play against that person of color at strategic moments. So I've asked, like, Kovacs and Rosenstiel are famously defending objectivity. I even wrote him an email. Tom, why are you clinging to a term you know is corrupt? Then I erased it. Then I wrote something a little bit nicer. But he wrote back to me. We've debated this. So let me go back to my notes. I know I've gone someone will rein me in at one point, right?
We can go to questions at any point.
Okay.
Back if
Okay, so I'm going to go to May of 2020. Journalists are getting beaten up in the streets. They're not happy about a whole bunch of things in newsrooms. But all the racial reckoning that's going on in the US is now going on in journalism, right? And Wes Lowry, in particular, two-time Pulitzer Prize winner at the Washington Post, he's not there anymore, not so surprised, writes a piece for the New York Times about a reckoning over objectivity in newsrooms. Now, and you can all find access to it. The column is obvious, just Wes Lowry, New York Times, objectivity. In it, he makes the point how objectivity has been used conveniently to not just suppress journalists, but also to suppress coverage, and what he calls a real kind of truth, right? He favors the term moral clarity. Now, I do agree with Kovacs and Rosenstiel on this, and they have this in the book, Elements of Journalism. Neo-Nazis have moral clarity. To me, that's still not the right term because it's based on something that is so individual, and a lot of people, unfortunately, have moral clarity. It's just not what I would consider my morals. In the same summer, and I think many of you know this story, Alexis Johnson at the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette, you saw the tweet. See, I'm glad I didn't eat the visuals. Actually, for my undergrads, though, I have the tweet and I have everything all set up. So her editor said she could not objectively cover the protests in Pittsburgh because her tweet of what was a Kenny Chesney concert with a lot of mess, she was going, oh, the horror of looters. Oh, really? It's just a Kenny Chesney concert. That constituted for that editor that she was biased. This same editor defended Trump calling Haiti a shithole country. And he went on Fox News to explain why he was correct on Alexis Johnson. So again, we've got two sets of rules here, right? So I asked my students, what term should we use instead of objectivity? And I'm talking about the scientific method. The way it's used against people as a weapon, that just needs to go away. But let's say we need a term. We can come up with anyone. One student said, like, why don't the grown-ups just call it critical thinking? And I said, that makes sense, yeah. So I think what we can do here is just sort of come up with our own strategies for whatever this thing might be, if you think this thing needs a name. I'm of the mindset now, because I used to say fully dimensional, accurate, verified, blah, 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 blah. But that's like a list. And I've actually decided, you know what? What if it's a checklist? Why does it have to have a name? Why does it need this label? When in fact, what we're all talking about is, to quote Ice Cube, check yourself. Right? I mean, there are things that when you get to every story, that instead of saying, I'm going to be objective, I'm going to accurately report the information, what if you said, what am I thinking the story is before I even start reporting it? What if you literally checked yourself and said, what do I think this story is? And then in the reporting process, I do call it like a 360, you did this. So what's behind me? What didn't I see? And that's hard. I know it's hard to know what you don't know. So that's one of the things I almost say it's like an assessment checklist more than saying I'm going to be objective or I'm going to report this objectively. And yeah, no one is objective. We all know that. Da 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 da. And the problem is objective is the opposite of subjective, and that's where all the trouble starts. So that's why I say, and people will try to call you on this stuff. People will say because you're X, Y, and Z, That's why you reported it a certain way. There's a reporter here in town who's gay, and he did an amazing, I'm telling you why he's gay for a reason. He did this amazing story on a sheriff whose camera crews, whose officers were beating up people on camera to be on like a live PD program, one of those programs, and then somebody died. But people who were supporting the sheriff tried to use this reporter's sexuality against him. It had nothing to do with the story. I mean, there's no connection whatsoever. That's just to say that people will try to find a weapon. I've been accused of being many things, and you know what? I am an old black woman from the South. Hello? Yes. Good. Your eyes are open. That's another thing I'll tell you. I have gotten where I am in this world because I know what white patriarchal newsrooms and academia want. We've all gotten to where we are because we know what the quote-unquote man wants. But somehow, it's got to be like Independence Day. They're using our satellites against us. We have to figure out how, within the boundaries of American journalism and the newsrooms where you work and the people you work for, how do you have your own, dare I say, moral clarity, but how you have your own checklist that you feel as if you're comfortable, that you have done what we call in academia and in a lot of ethnographies, saturation point. For journalists, that saturation point also comes with deadlines, because at one point you have got to stop. You've literally got to stop. But where do you feel as if, okay, I've reached my saturation point? Now, I know I've done a lot of talking. I want to hear from you all. Yes.
I don't know where this question kind of falls into the process, because I agree with everything you're saying, and I'm not trying to victim blame. But where do you think the use of Twitter comes into a role in all of this? It sounds like Twitter has kind of been the beginning of where these problems start. Do you think it's one thing to write a story for their publication, and it's another thing to tweet? Do you think that people should stay off Twitter? Like, where do you think social media comes into all that?
That's an absolute fair question, because in both of these instances, I would say the reporter tweeting about Kobe Bryant, she did not mention that she'd been assaulted. It was just like, hey, all this happy stuff about Kobe, let's not forget. That's probably not the type of tweet the Washington Post wanted, because they are, and Marty Barron was extremely strict. Know your policies, people. The one that the reporter did, to me, she was actually reporting on something on her beat. And I thought it was a wry observation.
That makes sense. I guess in my head I'm thinking of other examples from other reporters where I think their coverage is very good. I think their Twitter use is maybe not so good.
Oh, there are some, okay, this room only, even though it's being recorded, right? There are some political reporters who need to just let it go.
I guess my question has to do with, so my training, I've been very blessed to have worked at some really good places, and one of them, like the LA Times, one of the things that editors really instilled in writers, especially if you're writing story for the front page, is they want good analysis, right? They want you to lean on the expertise of your beat. They want you to tell the readers what this means. Just give me some analysis here, right? And I feel like at a lot of places that want that, the analysis part is what gets people in trouble.
And it's not labeled like that.
No.
I actually thought about that because a lot of what we've been doing has been making sense of what the power structure wants. And I thought about this because I'm a Talking Heads fan, I'm old. And I was thinking, what if we stop making sense? Or we create our own sense, but you're right. So they want you to just not, they want to go away from the old definition of just reporting to making sense. the tough part is people read that making sense as you're one way or the other way. And that puts you, the reporter, in a very difficult position, especially as you go on to other places or do other things. I think that's especially, I mean, y'all aren't young, I'm not saying you're inexperienced, but I think that's also very hard early in your career. Like, I won't let my students do that only because they don't know how to do that. Another aside, somebody wanted to teach my students about war coverage. It's like, oh yeah, that's like, I'm gonna put them on the rock climbing wall and then say, go climb El Capitan, right? So I think that's a very, very difficult position to be in. And I think it's almost one where the editors need to show you what they liked previously and what they thought went too far. Because I think it's hard unless you see what the too far is. So does that kind of help?
Yeah, I mean, I think I think one of the reasons that is pushed in some newsrooms is this idea that it elevates a story to not just be able to lay out what happened and who did what, but like give it the context, give it like why is this significant, that kind of stuff. But I think that too often that point of view comes from straight white males, and it's just like and
I like to use, when I don't want to say white patriarchal, I go the power structure.
Sure, and whatever it might be, right? And so I think that the stories are never two-sided or two-dimensional. There's just so many complex parts of it, right? And you might in some way get at it pretty well in a couple paragraphs, but you're still going to miss some things. And I think that's the juggling act that we fall
Oh,
into
it
sometimes.
is. It really, really is. And it's, I mean, we all do the nut graph, right? So we literally teach our students who gas. Who, then capital G, capital A, capital S. Who gives a shit? Right? Because they'll write something and there's that thing that's missing, and it's like, why we care. See, I would argue that you are all excellent journalists and know how to include context and everything like that quite naturally. And there doesn't need to be a need to say you need to put more analysis in the story. It's almost like, give me more words, allow me to breathe at the top of the story to give that context without giving you some sort of term. Because I think it's, again, we're getting into that kind of using terminology that isn't really precise. So I saw you had your hand up in the back.
I did, and I am loath to bring this back to a Twitter conversation because it's such a small element of what we do. But
it's the one that can get you in the most trouble.
It is. It is, and it's. I mean, it's a huge part of what I do. Certainly, you said know your policies, right? And I agree. I think we all do. But I do think about the Washington Post and the New York Times, and I think about, Felicia, who is an incredible journalist and who is pretty measured in her tweeting for the most part. And I think about other incredible journalists at the Post and at the Times who aren't terribly restrained in their tweets, and they are white men.
There was an interesting study that came out in the 50s by a man named Reed. It was looking at newsrooms. And again, non-journalist, he's observing newsrooms, and he realized very quickly there is a star system. There is a star system. And that's the problem with objectivity. Rules are applied when it's convenient to be applied. And that's the thing you all have to be aware of, right? You're all working for publications, money's been exchanged, they don't love you. Anytime money is being exchanged, it's not love. It's a transaction. So you need to understand those type of things. And you're absolutely right. And I was sort of hinting at that. There are certain people who are getting away with saying things that you can't get away with. That is a reality. Oh, can I make a push for something, by the way? Is that okay, everybody? We just created an ethical newsroom leadership modules that are free to everybody, and it talks about giving value to your voice. I'll share the URL with y'all. We're going to launch in a couple of weeks. It talks about these sort of things, like, let's say you at one point in your life were homeless, and your publication decides to do something on homelessness and they won't put you on the team? Or, you know, does your place have, what I worry about especially, does your publication have an online harassment policy? If it doesn't, you need to ask them why and get somebody thinking about that. Because more than getting in trouble for Twitter, people will harass you.
We've just come out of the Trump era, so do you think that that has
No.
emboldened?
That wasn't
Maybe
a
we're still
dream.
in it. I don't know. But do you think that has emboldened news organizations to say, you know, something's a lie, so we're going to call it a lie, or
Oh,
something's
absolutely
and
have to.
Yeah. And
And-
do you think that's a good development? Like, do you think that is hastening this move away from this, you know,
From the
false-
terminology.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, in fact, I was reading something the other day that said, repeating lies that have been done, I'm going to say this, and I will get in trouble. If you really believe that Hillary Clinton was running a child pornography ring out of Washington, D.C. pizzeria, don't read what I write or my content or whatever, right? So, but at one point, for those the people who are your audience deserve to know when something is not true. What's interesting about Tuckman, the most dated part of her piece, which came out in '72, is that she called journalists on this, that they won't say that X senator is lying, they'll say X senator said X fact, even though they know X fact is wrong. Well, I think the difference now is that either you wouldn't run it or you would say lied in saying blah, 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 blah. And I think that's that kind of fine line that you were talking about, like, okay, we want to start making sense of what's out there, but how do we do that within the constraints that our readership barely notices? Right? That we can do these things without saying, I am now telling the truth, as it really is with a capital T, not merely facts. And I think that's what's so hard, is we want to give people the truth. That's ultimately what we're aiming for with a capital T, and not just merely facts. But we want to do it in such a way that I think, this is like the thunder that was happening in Austin on Monday, if you were here. But I think you want to do it in a way that is elegant and clear and graceful. And I don't mean graceful in a spiritual sense, but just elegant production. Does that make sense? Almost? Okay. Oh, I will tell you this. I love this. I was in Toronto. Someone else probably said this, and it's super famous, and I'm sorry, I don't know who said it originally. But there's this big mural in Toronto that says, if you're telling a story, and on your path of telling that story, it never changes, then you weren't listening. And I love that. I love that. And that's why I say when you're writing a story, literally check yourself. What did I think the story was going to be about? Do all my quotes reinforce what I thought this was going to be about? Am I just playing that objectivity ritual where, oh, I'm going to use this quote and I'm going to use that quote? Even if you're not doing it, you know, in a very, very overt way. But are you writing the story you assumed you were going to find? You know? And I think that in and of itself is the check that we all need. You know, am I just putting everything in there because this is what I thought I was going to get? And just because someone said this is what happened, is that what really happened? This is not to call every police officer you're lying or this or that, but, you know, here in Austin, the first person who was killed in the Austin bomber was a black person, and police said it must have been a drug deal or a suicide. Man was revered in his community and everything like that, but it was a black man. Police said it was no big deal. Barely appeared in any of the local media. That's what we're trying to get past.
Just before we move on, I just wanted to build a bit on what Professor McElroy said and also Danielle.
You can call me Kathleen, please.
Cla-
But oh, give him the mic, though. Oh,
I don't know if mine's on. The point about stenography, I mean, obviously that's part of our jobs is we cannot just say Democrats said and then Republicans said. Like, that used to fly. Like, if you were on deadline, you could totally do that. But I think that Trump has if there was anything that happened, it was that can't fly anymore. If not only for the fact that people can get that on Twitter. People don't need journalists for that.
which also gets into what you were talking about. I'm going to get your first name again, Ricardo. Because it's like, look at sports, right? I've seen every live sporting event in the past, blah, 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 blah. Last I looked, St. Peter's was losing, okay? So I don't need for someone to tell me, so-and-so scored 22 points and led North Carolina to blah, blah, blah. So it's that, I think, and news is now trying to figure out that thing, the making sense of the facts rather than just reporting the facts.
Yeah, we were talking about including
And let me get your name.
Blaze Ganny with
Hey, Blaze.
WPLN.
Okay.
We were talking about, I guess, like omitting lies, like not including lies when senators or people tell them. When I write stories, I actually like to include the lies.
No, you can, absolutely.
Can you talk about, like, I guess, how to do that? And I guess usually what I do is include the lies and then try to point out the fact that what they said is very outrageous.
Right. So in repeating a lie that the ex-people have said about the 2020 election, or so-and-so like said, comma, repeating something that has already been blah, 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 blah. Still he insisted on, or she insisted on so-and-so. So I think that's where, I just came up with the phrase, making sense of truth. Maybe that's what we're all aiming for, is that line of, and we know what's true. And people want to tell us that they don't, but yeah, you're right. So what I mean is that some things, and this is really hard when you're trying to teach 19 and 20-year-olds journalism, and think about when you were, that I can't tell them to go get two sides of stories. Some stories don't have two sides, all right? Some stories, there is no reason to report on someone who is a Holocaust denier or something like that. No, that's not a story. That's not a thing, that person's voice. We do not want to legitimize illegitimate voices. And if I have one problem with a lot of the PolitiFact, in writing 20 inches on why something is liar, liar, pants on fire, you've given it like a modicum of legitimacy because you're paying attention to it. So I think that's the final, if a politician who is in charge of something important says something that's a lie about that, then yes, we do need to sort of address that. But I think too often we're giving legitimacy to random Facebook posts. So that's one of the things I think we need to sort of figure out. And the whole Trump era took a lot of air out of a lot of things. Could we have figured out what was going on with COVID earlier if we hadn't been devoting so many resources to Washington? Maybe not, but we just always have to be aware of what's sucking the air out of the room. As you move up in the profession, because I see you all as the next generation of leaders. That's the main reason I want to come and talk to you all, right? Think about these things as you get in leadership roles. What am I putting in my media outlet? What is on the air? What is in those pages? What am I doing with this precious news hole, whether it's a 30-minute, newscast or it's a 2 hours on something? What am I doing with that? Especially since now what we do, you do, is so much more precious.
When you're the reporter and you're trying to make your case, What do you say to your editor who doesn't agree with you?
Okay. I probably have been that editor who didn't agree, so I'm not gonna lie, you know? So, this is, it's not that I personally want to do this story, but this is a story that, from what I hear in the community, has been overlooked. This is a story no one has, let's play to those beautiful power structure things that they love to hear. Could be an exclusive, could be award winning, is something that I might be able to do, you know, give me a couple of days from my regular beat to explore this. I think there's something there. If you let me do some initial reporting, give me a day to do some initial reporting to see what I can come back with. You know, this is a story that the community, a community of news consumers would love to read. It's a business. Don't ever forget, this is a business.
How do you talk to your editor when he says, oh, hey, I want you to write about lawmaker who did wacky thing because it will get us clicks? And
wow,
because I think we all feel that pressure sometimes, or most of us. And when we're determining, you know, what we're putting in the paper, you know, sometimes they want the wacky
let's
stuff.
Take that. So let's take Wacky Guy. And is Wacky Guy doing that for that particular reason? What story can, you know what? I would love to, I'll give you a brief on Wacky Guy, but I want to do something more substantial on Wacky Guy. Okay? So there's a bigger story here. You know, what are his national aspirations? What do his constituents think of that? He probably, that's what they want to hear. But I think what you try to do is add some context to Wacky Guy. Keep Wacky Guy, but we all have a Wacky Guy. Keep Wacky Guy to a minimum if you can and say there's a bigger something there.
Yeah, kind of on a similar thread. I feel like when I'm doing the reporting, I'm able to capture all the nuance and, you know, many dimensions. But when it comes to writing, I always come up against, you know, audience attention span and readers who will not have the patience for me to explain in 30 words what can be explained in, you know.
What's your medium?
Oh, I am online.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, you know what? Boo, you can do it. And this is where, yeah, I think the more you do it, the more you'll become comfortable with whether it's the 4-word lead that captures what happened, whether it's literally the use of sentences, long and short, to drive readers in. I think sometimes, even with text, you can visually look the same way, and you're not giving your readers a break. I haven't read your writing, so this is not a real criticism, but I think what you've got to do is, again, if we're going to do with our start making sense, maybe I should call it as opposed to stop making sense. So what is it? And can you say that in 4 words? If that were, if you could tell the audience in 4 words, you know, maybe that helps you shape a more inviting intro into the story. Because they are only going to read maybe the first 3 or 4 paragraphs.
So I'm from a state where the majority party of the legislature has been in office for like the past 30 years. So there's a really strong sort of like PR, public communications aspect. And we found that whenever we write something that they don't agree with, then they do resort to this like objectivity sort of tool where they're saying we're partisan or whatever that may be. And I was wondering if you had any tips or thoughts of sort of getting past that, where I feel like my newsroom, generally, we try to move past this objectivity thing, and when people say things that aren't true, you know, we don't just report that. But I'm wondering, you know,
no, that's you're in
next?
very, very difficult situations. And it's real easy for Kathleen, who teaches 19-year-olds, to say, do so-and-so, do so-and-so, do so-and-so. Though I have to grade 19-year-olds, so it's not like my job is easy, right? I think this is one where your bosses need to protect you. And let me tell you something. We need to become fighters for truth. We need to get off the sidelines and be fighters for truth. Was it Rasa, the woman who won the Nobel Peace Prize? Yeah, if you look up, she has a variation of that quote in every story in which she's interviewed. We need to be fighters for truth. So instead of just saying, it's like, you know what? We're telling the truth. You can spin however you want to spin. We're going to tell the truth.
It's something that I feel like I see in the journalism field a lot, where there are a lot of like really well sourced, analyzed pieces, and then you'll see like a lot of just spin on Twitter or whatever, and I was just getting past that.
For your own mental health, okay? For your own mental health, don't pay attention to all of that. Recognize bullshit that's bullshit. The way the system is now, the ecosystem is not an ecosystem. It's something, but it's not a system. And if you know the work is good, you know that tweet's going to come anyway. That thing's going to come anyway. What's so sad is, and I used to be in charge of reader comments at the New York Times back when they had like 60 blogs or something ridiculous. It was some ridiculous number. Less than 0.05% of readers will ever leave a comment on anything or ever retweet anything like that. So the people who are doing a lot of this stuff are loud people. And you've got to remember that. And remember this too. If a hurricane is about to hit your, and I don't mean to make fun of the statesman, that was the old statesman, it's not now. I just realized she's there. Don't tell Manny I said that. He wasn't there at the time. If a hurricane, a flood, or any of those things are about to hit your communities trust you. They need you. They need you more than they will ever they'll let you know then. People start treating newsrooms as 911s. So just remember, and see, the thing is, y'all are in the political realm. So you're in the, what they call the trenches with the worst of the worst. And with systems that are designed to try to bring you down. But just know that as a whole, journalism is needed by the community, even if they don't tell you anything.
I just wanted to return to an idea. I'm Megan with Denver 7 in Colorado. Wanted to return to an idea that you had brought up about covering lawmakers and not covering their mistruths. The
mistruth, let's untangle that.
Mistruths. The issue that I find is that there are certain lawmakers in my state in particular that it's not one mistruth, it's not two mistruths, it's everything. And they're also political candidates who have a serious backing. And so it's not responsible for me to not cover them at all, to push back a little bit, but at some point, you know, there has to be some sort of a balance, and I'm having a hard time kind of striking that balance between constantly untangling some of the things that they're saying and also covering them as a serious candidate with serious backing. And so I was just kind of curious what your thoughts are.
Yeah, no, you have to cover these folk, and you just have to keep pointing out every time it's a lie. Make that your ritual. Figure out your ritual of pointing out every time it's a lie. And they may not like it. You are probably a really good person, and you will be polite, and you will do everything right that a reporter is supposed to do in terms of interpersonal communication. But they know these are lies. They know these are lies. And they know your job is to not tell lies. So I hate to say it's a game because there's some serious stakes here, but they know they're telling these lies. And I know that's very hard, and it seems like I kind of, just keep pointing out their lies, but you can't stop pointing out their lies. Your bosses might feel otherwise, but actually, this would be a great discussion to post with people who have been covering state houses for a very long time. And state houses, to me, are as wacky as Congress is now. State houses are full of some truly wacky people.
Hi, Uriel Garcia with the Texas Tribune.
I know your boss.
Yeah. It seems that there was at some point that political candidates wanted to reach out to their local newspapers and, announce their candidacy and set out their platform, or even current elected leaders would give routine interviews. Or it seems that's not the case anymore, and it's more routine to rather attack the local journalist or the local publication as a platform. So I'm wondering, where did that disconnect start happening and why?
So we were talking about social media, right? So it's interesting. I am really good friends with the people in public relations. There's a point to the story. We're being forced to teach a course that's called Journalism for Public Relation Majors. Truth is, public relation majors don't need to know how journalists operate because that industry can completely bypass journalism. And that's what's happening in politics, that's what's happening in sports, right? If you're the Dallas Cowboys, you barely need the Dallas Morning News to write anything about you. You have your platforms, you have direct contact with consumers, with fans and everything, and politicians in their own way have figured out that they really don't have to talk to, especially something like the Tribune. Maybe in smaller papers, but even then. So yeah, you're being bypassed. So I know that doesn't help, but does that confirm? A lot of that has started because there could be a direct connection to the voter, to the citizen, to the sports fan. And I sort of equate the two, that they don't need journalism as the middleman to make that connection. These are all great questions, though. I did want to leave you all with one thing. What is my blind spot, and what does my gut tell me? Now, those are two opposite type of things, right? Both related to bodies, but what is my blind spot, but what does my gut tell me? And a lot of y'all have been asking about the gut, because it's like, I know that's a lie, and I know that's so-and-so, right? But those are two things that I think will help keep you in check. And the last thing I want to say is, after all of this, trust your reporting, assessment, and content. Trust yourself. If you go in thinking, I don't know everything, or that I've done all of that, then trust yourself in the end, because people will tear you down. But you know that you would have done whatever that reporting checklist is that you want to have. So that's why I want to take it away from a concept of objectivity to like, hey, these are the things I'm going to do with every story, and I'm going to feel good about that story when I turn it in. So thank you all, have been fabulous.